Hello and welcome to Beyond Today, the program that addresses the future of our community through conversations with people who are working today for a better tomorrow. I'm Ray Shermonte, your host for Beyond Today and Assistant Executive Director for the Hillsborough County City-County Planning Commission. In our last program, we talked about the planned community. Today, we want to look at mobility, how we are going to get around in the future. Our guests are Diana Mendez, whose firm is the consultant on Heartline's Mobility Investment Study, and Lucy Eyre, Executive Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, responsible for managing the study. I'd like to ask you both, I guess, a question one at a time, and it's something that I think is somewhat new. I don't often associate women with being in transportation and engineering, and I'd like to find out how you got into your present positions. Diana, I'll go first with you.
Okay, I'll start. I came from an environmental and land use planning background, and I realized that so much of what we could do in terms of shaping land use and preserving environmental quality was related to the kinds of transportation systems that we put in place. So that was where my interest in transportation came from and how I got involved in mobility studies.
Lucy, how about you?
Well, I started out having a background in urban sociology, and I went on to get my master's degree in planning. And it was just through my career path that I wound up working for the transit agency in Miami, and some of you may know the Metro Rail system. And I just find transportation is fascinating, and in terms of how we look at a community and how a community grows in accordance with what kind of transportation system that particular community may have is a fascinating thing, and I find myself having a great time in Tampa now.
Diana, you talked a little bit about you got involved because of the environment. I think that's kind of interesting because planners, I'm not so sure in the past have realized the importance of transportation. You commented that it can change, I guess, the pattern of a community. Can you explain a little bit more about that, about protecting the environment through transportation?
Sure. Well, as we grow and as we have more population and employment, we need to develop places for those people to live and work. And how we plan our transportation system really dictates the types of development that are likely to occur. When we build wide roads that you can travel at high speeds, that means you can travel over greater distances and spread out the development over the landscape. Unfortunately, what that also means is that you can start to consume land more rapidly than we have historically. And if you look at the amount of land per capita that's been consumed in the Tampa Bay area over the last 10 years, you find that we are using up more raw land per capita now than ever before. If you start looking at different kinds of transportation systems that allow you to compact development and keep development from spreading over into lands that are perhaps environmentally sensitive or have high agricultural value, that's probably one of the best ways to maintain and preserve the environmental quality that's so important to us here in the Tampa Bay area.
Well, since we're talking about transportation and preserving the environment, that brings us to a subject that really I did want to talk about on the show, and that's this mobility investment study that's going on. Lucy, the MPO is managing that study. What is this MIS, as we hear it in the letters, for our audience to just understand what a study like that involves?
Well, as some of you may know, that the MPO board is responsible for putting a long-range transportation plan for this community. That plan tends to look at a lot of different things and may not get into the in-depth analysis that we need to have. So the next step would be to do a major study to decide what is really good for this community. And if we know that we're going to put in a lot of investment, obviously we have to be very careful. And so that's the reason why we have this study. And of course then, on top of all that, then it's a federal requirement. If we want to seek federal dollars, we need to make sure that we comply with all the requirements. And once again, this is kind of a next step to implement our vision.
Diana, this MIS process, this is a federally mandated process, I believe. Can you explain how they got involved and why in creating this whole process for studies?
Sure. As the national highway system neared completion, at the federal level, policymakers began rethinking how we go about transportation planning. Obviously, the interstate system was a major undertaking that took a lot of resources and was the focus of everybody's attention for the last 30 years. Out of that thinking came an act called the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, affectionately known as ICE-T, a little easier to remember. And that policy really opened up transportation decision-making to a much broader audience. At the real core of the federal policy thinking was that we need to look at the role that transportation can play as a catalyst to building healthy, sustainable communities. And that a really important part of that was the role of the local communities in deciding what best met their needs. So the idea behind that whole process is to open up the transportation decision-making process to allow the communities to decide for themselves what they would like their future to look like.
So this is really a way of allowing local citizens to have more input into what formerly was more of a federal process
And
in the past.
more of a technical process.
Right, to open up citizen input. So it's really more of a democratic process, I would say.
That's the basic underpinning of the process.
Lucy, a study like this, how long does this take to do?
Usually it's about, it runs between maybe a year to about 2 years. And in this case, it's about an 18-month process. And that has been our experience.
And what point are we in the process, in this 18th-month process? I know it's been going on for some time now and you've had a lot of meetings, but where are we about?
I think that we are in the getting close to the final stage of the study, which of course is the most important stage. We're beginning to have a vision on what we really want to see for Tampa in the next 20, 30 years. And this is where we are at right now.
Mm-hmm. Diana, I know you've done studies in other communities. I guess the process is evolving as it becomes more familiar to engineering companies such as yours, but how is the study in Hillsborough County and the other counties adjacent that are involved different or expanded compared to other studies you've been involved in?
Well, the first thing that's very exciting about this study is we have a 660 square mile study area involving 7 jurisdictions. And so just the opportunity for people from those various jurisdictions to come together and talk collectively about transportation decision-making has been of great benefit. In addition, we have had the opportunity to focus on land use issues as well as just the transportation infrastructure issues. And that's really so important because without the land use patterns supporting the type of transportation system you choose, it's not going to work. And that's when you start having problems of congestion and problems of lack of accessibility and mobility.
Lucy, you worked on the long-range transportation plan. How does this implement that or complement it, or is it in conflict with it? How does that fit together with what we already had in Hillsborough County before this study started?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we see this as the second phase to it. First, you have a long-range plan, which is sort of somewhat in a very fuzzy frame. And then with this major investment study, we're beginning to focus on a smaller area, even though that we're still talking about 600 some square miles. But it's actually a smaller area. Now we can actually get into more of the detail analysis. So obviously this is by no means not in conflict with the long-range plan. It complements the long-range plan. And because I mentioned that it's a longer vision, as a matter of fact, when we update a long-range plan, we're going to take those ideas and put that in our long-range plan. So obviously the two are working very closely together.
One of the things I think sometimes there's a misconception about this study that it's somehow a rail study. Can you explain this idea of multimodal concepts to people so they understand how that all fits together, that it isn't just rail?
The long-range plan obviously has all kinds of modes of transportation included in it. and highway will continue to be a major component. But what we are talking about is that we do want to give people choices. So we also explore transit. And to give you a flavor, when we start out with this process, I think there were like over 100 scenarios there. And we finally narrow it down to what we have a vision now. So you can tell that obviously we're not just looking at rail, we're looking at everything. Road projects, we're looking at ways to make people commute easier. You can carpool, you can van pool. I know you're one of the drivers for a very long distance van pool. So we're talking about just giving people all kinds of options. It's unfortunate that some people felt that it was a rail study, and it's just very far from the truth when they think of it that way.
I think Lucy's hit on an important point, that it is about choices. It's about having a balanced transportation system where we have all the tools at our disposal in use working for us so that we can travel most easily to and from our work and our play.
So you feel that some of the conflict in the past, I know when you talk to people about transportation, you have your mass transit advocates and your automobile advocates. Have we kind of gone away from that, and maybe you're looking at a bigger picture now?
Well, we have 30 years of history and planning practice to overcome in doing that, but I think the directives at the federal policy level, and combined with the enthusiasm with which local communities have embraced this new process, we're certainly making a lot of strides away from that single mode, single silver bullet solution, because I think we've all learned that to get a transportation system working, you need to have a diversity of different modes.
So we are kind of entering a new era. Now this process has been in existence how long, the MIS?
The MIS process has been in effect we're going into the 5th year, and it has done very well around the country, just because by opening up the process to a greater diversity of people, you're able to get more ideas, and more ideas inevitably lead to better solutions that work for a broader variety of people.
That's great. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the other ideas in our major investment study here in Hillsborough County and discuss some of the details of what's being studied at this time.
If there's a boat out there and he's stranded, that's us. We're out there, we're doing the job.
This is the real thing.
Yeah, anyone can be this crazy.
Boys earning their money today.
Now that's a resume.
I don't know, I'm missing something there.
This is New Guinea.
It's so powerful.
I don't see it.
I'm having an out-of-decade experience. I was walking and came upon a fountain which bore the sign, "Don't drink the water."
Do you
And the
get
beggar
this?
carries a
Isn't it
sign saying, "I'm
fantastic?"
blind." What does this poem mean to me? It's like a collage of images.
Let's
and
face it,
sounds.
not every cultural activity appeals to everyone.
Finding an oasis.
So we're giving you something everyone likes, a choice. That's why 23,000 arts and humanities groups are inviting you to find something you can get excited about. Just call for a free brochure about what's going on in your community.
I think I'm getting into this.
They're tuning up.
The arts and humanities, there's something in it for you. There's a lot going on in your community. For a free brochure on how to get involved, call our toll-free number.
Welcome back to Beyond Today. I'm your host, Ray Sharmonti, and we've been discussing major investments for transportation in the future with consultant Diana Mendez and MPO Executive Director Lucy Eyre. I'd like to get into a little bit of the details of the study that we're doing here in Hillsborough County, and it also includes Polk County and part of Pinellas and Pasco, I believe. So it does include, as you mentioned, 7 jurisdictions,
Yes.
I believe, which makes it very complicated. But One of the things that discussed that you hear people say is that, well, the problems aren't that bad now. And what is the answer to those people that say, well, you know, we're getting along okay at this point?
Well, you certainly have a lot of growth predicted here, with the population expected to increase by 40% by the year 2015 and the employment increasing by 65%. I mean, we would really be the envy of many jurisdictions in the Northeast and other parts of the country that would love to have that kind of growth. That growth is a mixed blessing. It means more economic development, it means more opportunity, but with it also comes an increased demand for traveling. And so the conditions that we see today will not be in existence 15 years from now. It's easy to think that 15 years from now, a typical trip, which might take 15 minutes to complete today, may take as much as a half hour.
So that's something we all need to keep in mind. I guess if we all think of what traffic was 20 years ago and project into the future, we might get some idea of how much worse it's going to get. And that makes you think more about the importance of a study like this in solving those problems. One of the things that we talked about, I guess, is this idea of expected roadway congestion. Now, we know that we have some roads now that are congested. Are there new roads that are going to be congested if we simply continue on the path we're on now, I guess, that aren't at this point? Roads that probably are somewhat free-flowing. How does that all play into this?
Well, definitely. It's a very simple equation. If you have more people, then you need more vehicles to be operated on roads. So eventually all those roads will be clogged up, whether it's existing roads or you're going to build some more. And I think the whole thing is that we need to understand that we should not settle for what it is today. We should always strive for doing better. And with this study, that's what we are trying to do. Is there another way besides building roads to satisfy that demand? And that's the question we have to ask ourselves. And it's not just this study, simply because we do deal with the long-range plan. Every time we look at the plan, we have to ask ourselves the same question.
Now, I guess we also have to remind ourselves that we're assuming that certain roadways will be improved that aren't now. We know that some roadways are going to get more congested, but isn't one of the basis for this study is to assume that certain roadways will be improved in the future? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, we do need to keep improving our roadway system, because even when a transit system is put in place, if people can't get to the transit system, it is of much more limited value. So there will be roadway improvements incorporated as part of the overall recommendation. But in the past, we've had the luxury of being able to, when a roadway reached capacity, if it's a 2-lane road, you make it a 4-lane road. If it's a 4-lane road, you make it a 6-lane road. That can't go on forever. Many of your roadways are very, very wide, and they do not have available rights-of-way to increase the number of lanes on those roadways. And we're very fortunate here in the Tampa Bay area in that we have some rights-of-way that are lightly used for freight purposes, but that would also provide an opportunity to move passengers in some of those rights-of-way. So it's almost an idea of recycling community infrastructure to get more capacity out of the assets that you already have.
I guess in the study now we're kind of at a point where we've looked at a lot of alternatives, and now we're getting to, I guess, what's called a preferred investment strategy. And can we talk a little bit about where that's going? What kind of components are in this preferred investment strategy? Lucy?
It goes back to what we mentioned before. We have a lot of the built-in highway facilities already included in the plan. We also reconfirm what we found out in our long-range plan, and that is, besides building the roads, we also need to look at other strategies. And in this case, we are looking into a light rail system that can utilize the underutilized freight lines that Diana just mentioned. And together, then, we can come up with a vision so that if you feel like driving, you can continue to drive, and hopefully the roads will be better simply because now we're trying to satisfy the demand by using some other means. And in this case, if you don't want to drive, you might be able to take the bus or the light rail system to downtown or to the university. And that's what we're talking about.
Now, I guess one of the important things it would seem to me in a transportation system is the idea of connecting activity centers. The preferred investment strategy, what are some of the activity centers that this type of system, both road and rail and bus, would connect?
Well, the USF area is today one of the largest generators of trips and is predicted to grow rather substantially in the future. The West Shore area is also a major activity center, as is downtown. So those are really the three key centers. We do expect to see a fair amount of growth in the Brandon area. Of course, the Brandon Town Center has already started to explode, and that trend is expected to continue. So we've been working towards a strategy that connects those four major attraction areas or generators of trips, but then also looking to our neighbors in the east in Lakeland and Plant City to provide some kind of connections between those areas and the employment areas, perhaps on a less frequent service basis, but certainly providing alternative means of travel during the peak commuting hours.
That would seem wise, having experience with I-4 myself. There's a tremendous amount of traffic that I see moving back and forth, and thinking that it would get worse over the next 20 years does scare me a little. So I'm glad that we're looking at that. Now, you talked about the major activity centers, but are there some other more minor ones? I shouldn't say Tampa Stadium is minor, but there's some sub-levels that would also be connected, also besides just downtown and West Shore in this proposal.
Absolutely, and you've mentioned a very important one, the stadium area. And certainly as we have tried to find routes which connect the major centers, we have wiggled them, if you will, to pick up some of those smaller activity centers, Sable Park, areas down in Port Tampa. Some of those areas are equally important in trying to reduce congestion.
Lucy, one part of this study, we always hear this, again, and we've talked about it a little bit today, is the land use transportation connection. And I know people use it in terms of just density, but I think probably urban design enters into that a little. And is there a part of this study that's going to deal with the issue of like station design and neighborhood compatibility?
Right.
How are we addressing that?
Well, Diana mentioned that within this study we deal with different jurisdictions, and that is definitely true. Besides just political jurisdictions, we also been in partnership with other agencies. And in terms of the land use connection, we actually have engaged the Planning Commission to be part of this, to work with the consultants. It's true, I don't think we should be talking about density per se. What we are talking about is the urban form. And with that, which means that we're going to identify areas that we think that this community can fit growth in. And then other areas that if the people decided they want to leave those areas alone, we should. And I really think that that's the basis of what we are trying to do, is to once again come up with a vision so that people can share. And I certainly feel that way because I am just one of the 900,000 residents here in Tampa, and I certainly would like to see this community grow that way.
Now, a lot of people's perception of mass transit, from my experience here, and if they've lived here a while, they've come from maybe large cities up north, is a New York, Chicago kind of concept where you do have high density. But aren't there other much smaller cities or really Sunbelt cities that have built systems recently that they might be unaware of? And can you tell us about some of those cities?
Absolutely. There's been a great success in such cities as San Diego. Dallas has recently opened a system which has exceeded all expectations because the predominant car culture in Dallas thought that nobody would actually take the rail transit, but in fact they've well exceeded their ridership projections from their first day of operations. They're a tremendous success story. Also, St. Louis is another success story. So these systems are at a smaller scale than the New York, Chicago type system, and what differentiates these newer systems is that they really are designed to be part of the community fabric, so that they fit in terms of scale. They aren't isolated from the communities of which they are a part, and that provides a real opportunity to provide a focal point for a community, almost as a town square, as you will, around the transit opportunities.
Well, that sounds like a very good concept. There's also been discussion, I guess, of people, the humans' opportunity for employment and things of that nature. How do you feel transit or having a multimodal system helps people with opportunities for bettering themselves, really?
Well, I think people are beginning to recognize that transportation is a major component to the economic viability of an area. So when we are talking about the Tampa Bay area, we are talking about having the opportunity for people to travel to their jobs. And I want to bring back to the point about also dealing with various modes of transportation. A lot of the investment is going to go to the reconstruction of the interstate. We see this as just as important as having some type of future rail. And that's what it is. Each step of the way, we want to make sure that this system will serve as many people as possible. Going to jobs, obviously, is very important because we can't do without jobs. We will all be in very sad shape.
Well, I think that's a good way to end the discussion of the major investment study. We covered a lot of different areas, and I appreciate you both being on the show, and I'd like to thank you for talking with us about this study. Our next show will be dealing with really an issue that is related to this, and that's the pedestrian, which is certainly a part of transportation. And let us know if you have any comments. We have a hotline that you could call. We also have an email address that's listed. I'm Ray Charmonti, your host for Beyond Today, and please think about the future, and we're going to plan on your behalf, hopefully. Thank you.